So welcome to this, the first of the roundtable discussions for One Voice Campaign. I'm delighted to be joined today by four extremely influential people in the field of the performing arts in the UK. I have with me today Paul Fleming, who is General Secretary-elect of Equity. Horace Trubridge is with us. He is General Secretary of the Musicians Union. We have Deborah Annetts, who is Chief Executive of ISM, the Incorporated Society of Musicians, and Philippa is with us. She is the head of BECTU, the Broadcasting, Entertainment, Communications and Theatre Union. It's really exciting to bring the four of you together in one place today to talk about the crisis that we're facing in the performing arts and how we might get out of this together. I'd like to talk about the future, of course, but first of all, I'd like to just take stock on where we are right now at the beginning of August and how we've got here. Deborah, I wonder if we can start with you, perhaps. Mm-hmm. How do you feel the government has done so far, and what more could they or should they have done at this point?
I think they started quite well with the furlough scheme, followed up by the self-employed scheme. But as the last few months have gone on, we've become increasingly concerned at the level of, frankly, chaos coming out of the government in terms of guidance. And the fact that some of those schemes, like the self-employed scheme, were not as comprehensive as we had hoped. I think the final kind of nail in the coffin in terms of confidence in the government was the bailout package of 1.57 billion, which has left freelancers absolutely high and dry. And we all know that the self-employed scheme is coming to an end in August. There's no sign of work this year, possibly not even into the early part of next year. And we urgently need an extension to that self-employed scheme. So I think the government has a lot to do to regain the confidence of this sector.
Absolutely. Paul Fleming from Equity, can I bring you in there? Do you echo those comments from Deborah?
Absolutely, and I mean, particularly with our membership, singers almost exclusively being freelance. I mean, they really have been left high and dry, frankly, since the beginning. The approach Equity's taking is we're talking about a four-pillar plan, and there's four pillars where we assess the effectiveness of the response of governments and the arts councils across the UK and engagers. And those four pillars are workforce protection, protecting the infrastructure of our industry. And that absolutely includes our comrades in BECTU to make sure that our members have workplaces with skills to go back to. Making sure that we have a safe opening subsidy, so as art is produced as soon as possible in a safe as possible way for audiences, and crucially, of course, for our members. And equalities, because of course this crisis, like any, is hardest hitting those people who the industry can least afford to lose if we want ourselves to look like the 21st century and be representative of the experiences of people living in modern Britain. And actually, on every single one of those four pillars, the government is currently failing. They've put £2 million, the Arts Council of England's putting £2 million towards freelancers. Equity alone put £1 million into our own benevolent fund. I mean, it really is chicken feed compared to the scale of the problem. It looked like they were going to support infrastructure, at least at the top end of town. That money has taken so long that you now have our permanently employed members, BECTU's permanently employed members, I'm sure MU permanently employed members now looking at down the barrel of a gun because they just haven't delivered it at any degree of speed. Safe opening subsidies, well, they can't even tell us when they're opening in any meaningful way. There's no additional support to make workplaces COVID secure. There's no additional money going in to make sure that we can make art as soon as possible. And equalities, we've had some victories in terms of making the government's health and safety guidance reflect more explicitly older workers, disabled workers, the traumatic experiences of Black communities and communities and artists of colour. But beyond that, where's the cash to do the necessary gap plugging? It's nowhere. So in terms of the government's performance, 1 star, I think, is currently the current rating. I wouldn't go see it.
Can I ask Horace Trubridge of the Musicians Union, do you think that cash is what's needed most of all right now, or are you looking for a really definitive opening date when people can get back to work?
Well, I think the latter would be great, but I just don't see it happening. We've been calling all along for money to be made available so that socially distanced live performance can take place. Gigs need about 80% capacity. So if they can put 30% in and someone else can cover, the government can cover the shortfall, then that will enable our members to start working again. Same with concerts, same with musical theatre. The difficulty with the 1.57 billion pounds is that what it shows is that the government doesn't really understand our industry. Certainly doesn't understand how musicians work, because it's all being aimed at creatives. You know, the government think that we're all creatives, that every musician is a creative. Well, every musician isn't a bloody creative. Some musicians have spent 20 years or longer becoming superb on their instruments so that they can present to the audience somebody else's creation. And without those musicians, you cannot get that creation across with quality. And these musicians are leaving the industry, they're leaving the profession. I'm having to look very carefully at my organisation and how we can save money, because we are losing members. We will go on losing members. All the unions represented on this panel will be in the same situation. They'll all be losing members. The live music industry has been placed in an induced coma, and while that continues, there is no opportunity whatsoever for performers. There is at least 39% of my members didn't qualify for the self-employed income support scheme. And a lot of this is to do with the way the government have introduced IR35. This is a thing that the HMRC operates, where it says to people who engage freelance workers that if certain, you go onto the HMRC website and you have to put all the details in regarding the work that they're going to be doing and how they're going to be paid, etc. And if it comes up saying, oh, it's IR35, you have to put them on PAYE. Now, local authorities who engage musicians to teach have looked at IR35 and they've gone, wow, the fines are massive. So look, we'll just put them all on PAYE. Put them all over onto PAYE, and then we haven't got a problem. We don't have to worry about it anymore. We won't get fined. But they're on 0 hours contracts. So they can't be furloughed for a start. And yet the bulk of their work, which is this teaching work, means that the self-employed work that they do isn't sufficient to qualify for the self-employed income support scheme. So we reckon, anything up to about 40% of our members are in that position.
Yes.
I've made this argument so many times to civil servants and politicians, and they go, oh yeah, it's terrible, isn't it? Nothing happens.
Well, let me pick that up with Philippa Charles from BECTU. Philippa, some of your members will be freelancers and some of them will be employed. Are you most worried right now about the freelance employees?
No, I think we're worried about everyone currently in the industry and particularly working in theatre. So like Paul and Horace, we have had many thousands of freelancers who've fallen between the gaps of the schemes. And I absolutely share their frustration about, the government's, I mean, let's face it, it's a decision they've made not to try and fill those gaps, because we and other organisations have given them solutions. They may not be perfect solutions, they may be difficult solutions, but they are solutions which would make sure that depending on what figure you want to go with, but over 1 million people across the economy are currently missing out in terms of the scheme. So yeah, we're worried about them. Many of our members have not had any income for months throughout the pandemic, but we're also increasingly concerned about the amount of redundancy consultation that we're involved in across theatres too. So I think currently we're our numbers are around 5,000 people who are at risk of redundancy across theatres, and clearly that's very worrying too. And again, I share the frustration around, I think we all get very excited when the government makes a big announcement, but the time that it takes, first of all, to get any understanding of the criteria, and then obviously the lack of speed in terms of getting that money out to theatres. And when you look at the detail, as I think we've always said, the devil was going to be in the detail. Actually, it looks to us really that money is about mothballing, effectively mothballing theatres until March 2021, when really we would like it to be, I'm sure we all would like that money to go towards supporting freelancers, supporting employees to make sure that they are able to return, but more importantly, perhaps to be thinking about innovative ways in which we can be putting on performances.
Absolutely. I'd love to come back to this issue of mothballing. You mentioned a minute ago that you've put a lot of solutions to the government, as I'm sure everyone on this call has. What's the mechanism by which you do that? I mean, does Oliver Dowden ring you up and say, pop in for a chat? What happens?
I wish. No. Most of the lot. Most of the lobbying has actually been through, in terms of finances, or certainly the most engagement that we've had, I have to say, from my perspective, the best engagement we've had actually is through the Treasury. So we have had discussions around the various schemes directly with Treasury officials, and my colleague and others I know have been involved in direct discussions with Rishi Sunak at various points to argue around the schemes. But personally, I haven't felt that engagement from DCMS has been as good as I would like it to be, and I get that they're under pressure, and it's a relatively small department, but I've been disappointed, I think, with the lack of response from them to this crisis.
I just spoke earlier today to one of the MPs who sits on the Culture Select Committee, who recently released that report, the first report into COVID in the performing arts, which was very critical of the government. Horace from the MU, can I ask you, did you give any evidence to that committee in advance?
I did. I was one of three that gave evidence to the committee. And yes, I mean, there was some very good people on the committee. Kevin Brennan, particularly, is very strident in what he has to say about the way that performing artists and particularly musicians have been neglected by the government. I'm very disappointed that the report from the Select Committee doesn't seem to have had any traction at all with government. And I hear, we all hear rumours, we all hear things, don't tell anyone, but I'm hearing that it's Rishi Sunak that's actually making all the decisions about where this money is going. I really didn't realise that he was such an expert in arts and culture. In fact, I doubt very much if he is at all. And he shares that with Oliver Dowden, I'm afraid, as well. I mean, Caroline Dinage has been much more engaged with us as unions and representatives of musicians than Dowden has. Dowden has tended to sort of hide in the background most of the time, I think. And she makes all the right noises, but nothing comes out that gives you confidence. And this is the thing I really wanted to talk about, because it's having confidence in the department that's supposed to be looking after our workforces is so important. You have to have the confidence that they understand the industry, every aspect of it. Philippa's members, Paul's members, Deborah's members, my members, understanding where we all fit in the ecology of it, and that if one part of it is neglected, then the whole lot starts to fall down. I mean, I don't represent sound engineers and lighting engineers, but these are very, very skillful people, and you need hundreds and hundreds of them to put on a festival, to put on an arena gig. They're leaving the industry. They're leaving the industry. So even when we do get the opportunity to start again, the talent won't be there, the skills won't be there, the workforce won't be there.
Can I pick that up, Horace, with Paul? Can I just go back to Paul Fleming from Equity and the issue of mothballing, Paul, do you think that the public quite understand yet what might be happening over the next 7 or 8 months? That there might be just nothing going on in the cultural sector?
I don't think they do, and I think, you know, if you want to, it's the reason why within our sort of 4 pillars approach we have one which is about protecting infrastructure, and we have to accept that there is some infrastructure, particularly the hyper commercialised sector, that is going to have to be mothballed, where there needs to be some honesty about that, and that mothballing requires protecting the people involved in that infrastructure as much as it does the physical buildings, and making sure that the glitzy, you know, bar restaurant plan that was always on the cards happens. What I don't think the public really understand at all is, quite in contrast to New Zealand, where I've been talking a lot to our colleagues around the world. In New Zealand, the government has freed up funds in order to have outdoor performances, pod working, where companies, musicians, technicians, stage management, performers, creative team members all work together, go off and work safely. This is a massive opportunity, actually, to address some of the key strategic priorities of the Arts Council, like arts cold spots, like theatre into education, like providing culture. You know, small scale theatre done in that way could be a phenomenal part of providing culture as a way out of COVID. It isn't happening, and it's because the government doesn't have that plan. And actually, I think what we all would say, and you know, everybody on this call, all of our organisations have been part of protesting the approach towards culture for 20 years. What coronavirus has laid bare is a pandemic of precarity that has been going on for 20 years. The increasing freelancification of our members' jobs, the increasing precarity, the decreasing margins involved as the government seeks to squeeze it. And actually, this is a problem of their own creation. It's not a creation of coronavirus, and we have to have some real backpedaling on the approach that they've had for 20 years to get us out of this mess. But are people expecting no culture to be provided over the next essentially 6 months? No, they're not. And I think they're going to be shocked when it doesn't happen.
Yeah. Can I go back to Deborah Annetts from the ISM? Deborah, can I ask you, Philippa mentioned a minute ago about the solutions that were presented to government. Do you think there's an opportunity here for people to unite across the performing arts sector and come to the government with just a few concrete proposals that they could really get behind?
Absolutely. I agree with everything that my colleagues have said this afternoon. I think that there is this massive issue of talent draining away from all of the various professions represented here this afternoon. And I know, like Horace, many ISM members are thinking, right, I will go and retrain as an accountant or something like that. I've got members who are now working as Sainsbury delivery people, which is fine, but I worry for the state of their fingers, really. What are they going to be able to do when they come back to the profession, say, in 6 months' time? And we need to be protecting the talent as well as the infrastructure. So I think all of us here need to be working together and calling on the government to make sure that the self-employed scheme is extended, but also do something along the lines that Paul is suggesting vis-a-vis New Zealand. If you look at Germany, I think also we should look outside of the UK. If we look at Germany, a huge amount of funding goes into their arts there, which leaves us stranded, frankly. And that's why we're in such a mess, because everything works in this country more or less on a commercial basis, even if you have Arts Council funding. So if something like a pandemic comes along, there's nothing to support it, and everything topples over. So the infrastructure topples over because it's not properly funded. But we also have the issue of the contracts knocking around as well. And I've seen some appalling contracts in relation to the self-employed, where force majeure clauses are used to shift liability entirely onto the artist. So as a sector, we need to be asking ourselves some hard questions about how do we protect the talent? What contracts do we want in place so that people are properly protected and not taking all the risks? Because at the moment, the risk is falling disproportionately on the freelancers and indeed some of the employed working on self-employed contracts within the education system. So the risk has got to be shifted back to the employers, to the contractors, and away from our talent.
Now, as heads of bodies that represent the workforce in the performing arts, you presumably are representing your members to the people who employ that labour. And that's the institutions, isn't it? It's the theatres, it's the live music venues, it's the producing companies, etc. But at the moment, all the rules and the money is coming from the government. And where do you feel your biggest argument is at the moment? Is it with the institutions or is it with the government? Philippa, can I ask you on behalf of BECTU to answer that one?
Yeah. So obviously we've got a huge argument with the government about the need to support the sector in terms of getting money to institutions quickly and enable them to be able to support support our members. But I think equally we need to be aware of for some who maybe have been looking for an opportunity, it might be an opportunity to introduce some measures, changes to terms and conditions that they might have been wanting to do for some time, but this pandemic has actually given them perhaps the opportunity to argue for more vociferously. So yeah, whether it's restructuring or whether it's changes to terms and conditions, I think increasingly we are going to be having that argument with institutions too, unfortunately.
But the institutions we're all on the same side, aren't we? I mean, whether you're representing a membership of 40,000 or whether you're an artistic director of a medium scale regional theatre, we're all in the same boat, are we not? Paul, do you want to pick that one up?
I mean, yay and nay, right? There is, we are at the minute. Everything is in flux. We're talking about some of the biggest commercial operators. Terrible news coming out of Birmingham Hippodrome today in terms of the delay of their pantomime, the impact that has on all of our members. The slowness of this government money to arrive. Big commercial operators being put at risk. But let's also remember, where these crises always tend to fall most, and they always tend to fall most at the people who are on the lowest sets of wages in the most precarious types of employment. And we are absolutely, and full credit to producers, particularly in the theatre sector, it has to be said, who, from our experience, when they've been lobbying government, they've been speaking up for the freelance workforce, they've been speaking up for the industry, they've been talking about both safe opening subsidies and costs to mothball where necessary. They've done it all. But the interests of capital and labour are fundamentally different in this industry as in any. And actually, this is the big question which you asked before about mothballing. For us, mothballing includes people. Does it for all organisations? Well, it doesn't for all organisations. The government's breaking point for some of them, it includes the closure of a building. It doesn't include redundancies. The government's breaking point, does it include the loss of our young black members with caring responsibilities who can't go off and get a second job because they can't leave their kids or their parents at home alone? And actually, do they really care whether they can be left in there? Those interests are really, really different. So we are on the same page in terms of getting a deal for our sector, but we have to recognise we might speak with one voice, but what motivates those voices is fundamentally different. And I think we always have to be very clear about that as people who represent the workforce.
Yes, indeed. Do you think that even though, if one accepts what you've just said there, Paul, that the severity of this crisis is such that we have to try to unite somehow, whether you're Cameron McIntosh or whether you're running a small arts organisation in a regional theatre somewhere, that somehow we have to make common cause? I mean, Horace, would you like to go on, Paul? Sorry.
I don't know. I think absolutely we do. But we have to realise that our instinct is to protect our members. Their instinct is to protect their organisations and their capital. Actually, at the minute, those interests are aligned, but are they going to leave us behind afterwards? And I really, really hope that they don't, and we will hold them to account to make sure that they don't. And doing things like seeking long-term changes to terms and conditions in one direction is not bringing us along on that battle. And Going forward, if we're going to have one voice, we all have to have an equal stake in that table, and recognising that the power dynamics, unless people are in strong unions, that power dynamic isn't going to balance out.
Well, let me pick that up with Horace Trubridge from the MU, if I may. When I was training as a musician, nobody really talked to me about membership of a union, and it's never been required. I am a member of one of the organisations represented here today, and I won't tell you which one in case I'm accused of favouritism. But I wasn't told that I had to join a union. Horace, do you think people should have to join a union?
Well, I think it's in their best interest to be a member of a union, because naturally, we're stronger together, and that's really what you've been talking about. But Paul's absolutely right that we don't all have the same agenda. I mean, for instance, right now there are negotiations going on between my officials and major employers of musicians, which involve the employers of those musicians wanting major concessions in the agreements, which they are not willing to agree to revert back to current terms and conditions at any time in the future. Now, this is a classic example of never waste a good crisis, in my opinion, because, there is, for us, we're more than happy, our workforce is more than happy to share some of the burden that this pandemic has poured on our professions. But, the suggestion that there will never be good times again and you can never go back to the terms and conditions that you had before the pandemic hit is ludicrous and firmly rejected, I'm sure, by all of us on this panel. So, I would, my message out there to employers is please don't try it on. We're having enough grief as it is. So let's all try and work together. But Paul's right, it's like the music venues. It's easier for the music venues to mothball. That way they can survive. But that doesn't help my members. That doesn't help Paul's members, Deborah's members, Philippa's members. It doesn't help them at all. But yes, of course, that helps the music venues survive so that they can re-emerge at some point. But I made the point earlier about the industry being placed in an induced coma. How long has this coma got to go on for? How long do we have to put up with trickles of money coming from the government that simply enable a theatre or a live music venue or a concert hall to remain shut?
But some people might say it's not the government's fault that they can't give you a date on that. If there's an uptick in infections, they have a public health imperative that they have to keep the public safe.
Yeah, but I'm not talking about a date where things can go back to normal, because that's way over the horizon. What I'm talking about is money should be used with innovative ideas that Paul's already hit upon, which will enable live performance to take place with social distancing, where it's necessary, but to enable it to happen. And if that means those performances have to be underwritten so that they break even, then let's do that. That's a much more sensible way of maintaining the workforce and maintaining some kind of art and culture in this country than just simply saying, we'll pay you to stay shut.
And actually, that's what's happening with the hospitality sector. So they've just launched the Eat Out for £10 and we'll pay the other bit. So it seems to me if the government recognises that the hospitality sector is really suffering because of the pandemic and the fact that restaurants and pubs, etc., can't work in the same way, well, we're in exactly the same boat. So therefore, there should be some kind of conversation along that model.
Philippa from BECTU, would you agree with that the government should be subsidising the social distancing that's required?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, it's it's really depressing, actually, isn't it? If you think about the next 6 months without any live events or theatre, and so yes, absolutely, they should be thinking outside the box in terms of how what we can put on and how we can make sure there is new work getting out there. People are getting the opportunity to perform. Yes, absolutely.
But in Europe, they seem to be doing so much better at working out how to make this happen. I mean, Paul, do you have any contact with your colleagues on the continent? And are you surprised that we're struggling so much with this here in the UK?
No, because fundamentally, their day-to-day activity is set up better to do this. If you have an adequately subsidised sector, if you have adequate support for artists, as they do in France, as they do in Germany, as they have in the Nordic countries, as they've, they're introducing in Spain as a result of the pandemic, what you have is an ability for the artists to survive. You open your venues without a profit motive, and you provide culture to people, because it is about understand what does this government actually believe ordinary people in this country are entitled to. I believe that every working person is an artist, and that every artist has the right to a dignified working life. And actually, I believe that people have the right to consume culture as soon as it is safe to do so. And Horace is right when he says, we don't want a date where things return to normal, because we don't want that normal back. What we want is, if we look at the Eat Out to Help Out scheme, why can't we have a system in this country where everybody gets X amount of vouchers to go and see live performance every year? Because you can go into museums for free. How is it any different from that? And lots of countries on the continent, you look at a mid-price ticket to go and watch a show at the National Theatre, or indeed on the West End, if you're moving into the commercial sector, it's a fortune to bring a family of 4 to consume culture in that way. Well, we don't want to return to that. We don't want to return to that precarity. We want the government to turn around and say, hang on a minute, this house is a beautiful house, one of the greatest success stories of the British economy, built on shallow foundations. Coronavirus has shook it. We don't want to go back to normal. We don't want to go back to where theatres have to open a cafe, a restaurant, a bar in order to survive. We don't want them to have to put on a West End transfer or a commercial tour in order to survive. We want them to be able to produce art to a diverse audience with diverse artists, diverse technicians, diverse backstage staff, on a good day as well as a bad day. And that's what it shows, and it is about, and I know I'm slightly ranting now, but it is about, if you talk about the people in government and their approach, when you see your child in a nativity production, do you think to yourself that child should be able to go on and become a professional actor? If you see them doing a peripatetic music lesson or showing an interest in art, do you think that they have the right to go off and be an artist as a professional? Because those people who are making the decisions at the minute don't have to think that question, because we know that Eton College is currently doing live performance in their theatres, in their school, in a safe way. But actually, this is about something that runs right through our society as to who this government feels can be artists and what artists are owed when they're at work. And this is the time to pause and have a think about what we really mean as a country in terms of entertainment and performing.
There is so much synergy between what you're all saying on this call that the interested viewer who perhaps isn't a specialist might watch this and go, how come there are 4 of you? Why isn't there just one union that represents everybody in the performing arts? Horace, what would you say to that?
Well, we've been around for 124 years, and I think, having been a musician, I think musicians, and probably each of us would say the same thing about their sectors, but musicians are a particular breed. They have, in terms of the way they work, it's probably different to the way Paul's members work, and it's different to the way that Philippa's members work. Amalgamating unions hasn't got a great history, and I think while we can all stand on our own 2 feet, and God knows how long that will be for, because this pandemic is hitting hard in trade unions, particularly in trade unions that represent a lot of self-employed people. If we can all stand on our own 2 feet, I think we prefer to. We work very closely together, we respect each other, and we combine when we need to.
Can I just pick up on something you just said there about amalgamation with Philippa Charles from BECTU? Philippa, BECTU is now a section of Progress, whereas you were independent up until...
Prospect, yeah.
I'm so sorry, Prospect.
Yeah.
Whereas you were independent up until 2017. What's your feeling about amalgamation?
So I think the strength of BECTU's amalgamation with Prospect has actually been that we've maintained our brand, we've kept our sector together, and we've got, you know, many of the same staff who were there before. So what we've benefited from, though, I think, is the resources of a bigger organisation, which is obviously able to help support us in sort of moving forward, improving our sort of digital reach. We've rebranded recently, and that's, I think, has been a really positive move. So I think the importance, I guess, if unions are going into a merger, is to try to maintain the identity of the members that work within that particular sector. And I hope that will continue to actually you know, be a strength for BECTU within Prospect. But yeah, I agree. Generally, mergers can be very tricky, very difficult to navigate, and you know, you do sometimes see smaller organisations who have had a good reputation sort of swallowed up and sort of effectively disappear within a bigger, more general union.
Right.
But that won't be happening with BECTU.
I'd like to ask the four of you about a really important moment that's coming up, which perhaps isn't on people's radar yet because they're firefighting the immediate crisis, and that's the comprehensive spending review that the Chancellor will be engaging in the next couple of months.
That's funny, I thought you were going to say Brexit.
Yeah, I thought you were going to say Brexit as well. That bothers me way more than the comprehensive spending review.
Same here, Deborah.
Well, Deborah, let me pick that up with you then.
We are facing an absolute calamity, possibly more in the music sector than in theatre, once we get to the end of this year, because all the signs are that government is not listening to constant representations that we need something like a 2-year multi-entry visa. And what that means is musicians are not going to be able to tour as they can do at the moment. They're going to have to check every single country that they want to get to and see what the visa requirements are. And there are all the additional costs, like carnets, like the musical instrument certificate, like health insurance, the tax and the social insurance implications. So from my perspective, as somebody representing over 10,000 musicians, I can see the pandemic slamming straight into Brexit, and musicians, there is no hope for them at that point. So I don't know how we get that message across to the government that they are at risk of totally destroying the music industry, because that is what we are facing unless we get some kind of traction in relation to touring in Europe.
Some people watching this might say, well, we don't even know if we can travel to other countries, if we can go on holiday, and we don't know how long that restriction is going to last. So it's difficult for us to
but the pandemic isn't going to last forever, right? We are going to come out of this at some point. And if we're going to come out of it successfully, then we need to have sorted out how musicians and other members of the creative sector can work easily in Europe. Because going back to the funding point, an awful lot of musicians have to work in Europe because there isn't sufficient good quality paid work in the UK. And I don't see that changing anytime soon in terms of a properly funded music model. And therefore musicians will need to travel. And what I'm hearing from government is, why can't they go to the US or Australia or Japan? Well, think about it. It's a long way away for a start. And we all know it's really difficult to get into the US to perform. So this government does not understand the value of the creative industries in terms of its financial aspect, or indeed of the soft power that the creative industries bring to this country. And working together, we have got to get the government to start listening.
I wonder if, because I'm conscious of time, I wonder if we can wrap this up by just me asking you for a very short 45-second imagining of a better world for the performing arts in this country, and how you think we might get there. What's your dream? Philippa from BECTU, can I start with you?
Well, I think we've talked about that a little bit, haven't we, through the conversation? But certainly, more investment of public money in terms of supporting the arts and the creative sector, a more diverse sector too, so that everyone feels that there's a place for them in whatever they want to do within the creative industries, and I guess a government that understands the industry and wants to support it and wants to promote it, because it is so important to the UK economy. So that would be my dream, I guess.
Paul from Equity, would you agree with that, or are there other things you would add?
I mean, who could disagree with that? As ever with Philippa, how could you possibly disagree? But I think if we go back to those 4 pillars, I mean, that is, you know, what we want is an industry in which the workforce is protected and respected, something like a universal basic income, a proper recognition of the fact that the freelance workforce in this country is the bedrock of the economic success story that we have. And protecting infrastructure, let's build it, let's develop it. Let's not just talk about those big concert halls and theatres. Let's talk about village halls. Let's talk about open performance spaces. Let's talk about dance spaces. Let's talk about how we bring professional culture to so many culture cold spots. Let's talk about safe opening subsidy should evolve into a world where you don't have to rely on the market, you don't have to rely on mixed models, you don't have to open a restaurant, you don't have to get match funding if you're an independent artist. Actually, we have a government that recognises that putting that money in to get audiences there is in the long-term economic health of a post-carbon economy. And finally, that equality stuff. How are we going to end up with an industry that genuinely looks like 21st century Britain unless we have all those things in place, and unless it is something that we're all talking about with a degree of self-reflection about who we are as individuals, about what our organisations are. And you know what? I mean, you can't be anything but hopeful right now. And you know, the 4 of us, the 4 of our organisations are strong voices. And one of the advantages, we're speaking with one voice, but we're hitting with 4 fists. And I think that we're in a good position to see a different world after coronavirus if we remain focused on that and keep our members at the heart of the answers.
Yeah. Horace, Trubridge from Musicians Union, once you've stopped hitting with your fist, what does a better world look like for you?
I think a better world is one where the government wakes up and realises some truths. Why do people come here on holiday? Why do they come here to study? Why do they come here to work? From all countries, from all over the world. A massive, important part of why they come is arts and culture. And if you let that wither and die, you will lose that. Also, people listen to this country when this country speaks. And again, that's because of our history of art and culture. So, you know, recognise those things, invest properly in arts and culture, look after the workforce, and that way you will maintain the enormous amount of money that it's worth to the economy every year.
Deborah Annetts from the Incorporated Society of Musicians, shall I give you the final word?
Thank you. I agree with everything my colleagues have said. I'm just going to say one other thing, which is we must protect education as well in terms of the arts, because I'm very worried about the number of music courses which are closing in higher education, but even more so the fact that we're losing music education in our schools. And when we talk about access, that is where it starts. It starts in the classroom, in our maintained schools, not in the private schools, in the maintained schools. And we need to make sure that the government doesn't use COVID-19 as a way of getting rid of music education.
Deborah Annetts from the ISM, Paul Fleming, General Secretary of Equity, Horace Trubridge from the Musicians Union, and Philippa Charles from BECTU. Thank you all so much for giving up your time today. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.